Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this week we are covering Chapter 19. So it's the 7th week of the semester, and we have a quiz this week. And Chapter 19 is a chapter I really like because it's about the Industrial Revolution and its impact. Well, that's the main theme of the chapter is Industrial Revolution. So there's a whole bunch to unpack in the chapter. And then also the chapter talks about, what are the effects of industrialization. And so we'll talk about that. There's some social effects, obviously. And then also the chapter weaves in this narrative of the rise of nationalism. And that ties in a little bit with what we were reading last week about Japan and some of the other countries and the changes in governance and the regimes in charge and the rise of authoritarianism, which we touched upon last week a little bit. And we'll talk about that again in the context of the Western world, meaning Europe, in this chapter. So the Industrial Revolution, what is it? What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is, and we're talking around the late 1700s, so the late 18th century, and the certainly the 19th century, the 1800s, and the Industrial Revolution is this period of time where, like, the factory system is invented, modernization, modern manufacturing is invented, and prior to the Industrial Revolution, most everything that was made, whether it was products or clothing, textiles, was all done in homes or by craftsmen. So one-off type production. And so the Industrial Revolution comes along and changes that. And there's this big push towards the science of manufacturing things and the processes and the rise of mechanization. So another way to look at it is sort of, machines take over where people did work with their hands in the past. And the other important change is that there's a new power supply out there, and it is steam and the steam engine and coal. So the steam engine's invented in the mid-1700s by a guy named James Watt. Actually, the first steam engine is from the 1600s, also in England, but it doesn't receive the merit of being the first mass-produced steam engine. So James Watt is really the one who invents sort of the practical or applicable steam engine, if you will, and that changes the way that production happens. In other words, in the old days when things were run by water wheels on a river, then factories had to be near rivers to have that power. But with a shift to coal and the invention of the steam engine, now you could have power anywhere. So you could put your factories anywhere, in any city, any place, any time, just like they are today. We don't depend on location for factory placement in our society, other than for transportation reasons. So that's a big thing, that this industrial impulse is unleashed and the technology is coming along to build better machines, machines that'll do more things, and it's all powered by coal. So that's sort of the big stuff. But the other things that happen with the Industrial Revolution is that there is a big rise in urbanization, and urbanization means people moving to cities. So as factory work takes over, a lot of people move out of the country into the city. So there's a real decline in the number of agricultural workers and an increase of people moving to the city. And that trend is reflected in England in the 1700s and 1800s, and especially in the United States after 1850. I think in the U.S. around 1875, more of the population lived in cities than on farms. And prior to that time, it was dominant agricultural economy in the U.S. So those are some of the Industrial Revolution things, this idea of mechanization, this idea of urbanization, and this idea of a new power source in coal and steam. The other thing is, when it comes to mechanization, are inventions like something called the flying shuttle that you'll read about, and you don't need to know what flying shuttle means, but what it is it's a process where cotton fabric can be made with machines. No longer does it have to be spun and woven by hand, but it can be done by machines, which means the amount of cotton one can produce, it increases exponentially. And the cool thing is, and it's really hard for us to understand, but prior to 1800, there was no such thing as cotton fabric. It was out there, but it was rare, and clothes were not mass produced with cotton at that time. So everything we wear, from our T-shirts, to our jeans, are cotton, and cotton fabric was really a new thing in the late 1700s, and that was a vital part of England's rise as an industrial powerhouse, along with steel and iron producing as well. So those are sort of the biggies. And the first railroad is invented in England in 1804, and it has to do with industrialization and hauling ore back and forth, and this idea of access to coal, access to raw materials, and the ability to feed workers and a banking system. These are all components that happen around the time a country industrializes. I had a professor once in grad school, and he always claimed that an industrial revolution cannot occur without an agricultural revolution. And that makes a lot of sense. In other words, if people are moving to the cities, you have to have a way to feed them. And the only way you can mass produce food and get it to the cities is to have a strong agricultural sector. And there were a lot of technological advancements in agriculture around this period of time also, which really increase the yield of crops from a given space of field. So farming became more efficient, more food was produced, and that allowed the Industrial Revolution to occur. So not on a quiz, but kind of important to keep in mind as you kind of figure all this stuff out and think about the way the world works. So and subsequently, those are the things you have to have for an Industrial Revolution. You have to have raw materials. You have to have the ability to feed workers, and you have to have some sort of banking system typically to make it all work. So there's that part. As far as what happens with industrialization, what does it lead to? There are negative and positive consequences. So the negative consequences, according to our text, is that with industrialization, there's a disparity in wealth. In other words, the rich get richer, the working class gets poorer. So that is certainly true in most situations, but at the same time, so that's a negative consequence of industrialization is disparity in wealth. At the same time, a positive consequence of industrialization is sort of counterintuitive considering the negative, but generally industrialized societies have a higher standard of living. So there might be a higher standard of living. Everyone might make more money, but still that disparity between rich and poor grows in industrial societies. And it's an important point. So it's an important point. We're going to talk about Marxism in a second, and I'll kind of come back to that disparity, income disparity. The other thing I want to say is there's a big population explosion in Europe and in the U.S. in this period of time of the early 1800s. And one of the things that's important to know is the stuff we just talked about. So and the book makes a great point. It said when societies are free of war and are healthy and fed, and there are no epidemics, populations increase. And the reason that happened in the early 1800s is because the smallpox epidemic had pretty much been eliminated. There was a more efficiency in agricultural operations, so more food was available, and there were fewer wars in this period of time of the 1800s. And all of those things together are, that's a classic quiz question. All of those things together really contribute to the rise in population. So you should understand that. And so those are three quiz questions right there. Negative consequence of industrialization, positive consequence of industrialization, and what are the causes of population increases typically. So those are some quiz questions for you for this week. And then also note that goes along with this idea of disparity between rich and poor, this idea of an emerging working class, so an industrialized or a factory working class, the workers, and then also the emergence of a middle class, so the industrial middlemen, the middle managers. Those are all new class structures in English society and in most other Western societies around the same period of time. And that's really important when we talk about these classes and class struggle. That will sort of enter us into a discussion on Marxism, which we will get to. And that's the center of Marxism, are this struggle between these two classes, this upper class and this working class. So more on that in a little bit. There's a section in the book, and it talks about all the things, all the inventions that came out during the Industrial Revolution. And The impact of these inventions cannot be overstated, because prior to the 1800s, for the most part, technology really hadn't changed since Roman times. I mean, illumination was via fire, so via candles or torches, and energy, power was from water wheels and rivers, and so there hadn't really been any major changes since ancient times. I mean, a lot of the transportation was still horse and buggy, so that's the same. There were no railroads, no internal combustion, nothing like that prior to the Industrial Revolution. But the book makes a good point that the major inventions of the era are electricity for sure, the internal combustion engine, radio, telephone, the automobile. So all of these things are starting to be invented, if you will, in the 1880s. And electricity, of course, is a huge one, is a biggie. So make sure you know what those major inventions are of the late 1800s, and also understand that as industrial societies grow, it really starts this trend for a global economy, worldwide trade. So that is a factor that comes out of industrialization, is this idea of global trade, both to sell products and to get raw materials, which really was advantageous to people like Great Britain, who had colonized, India and all these other countries. So they had access not only to markets, but also access to raw materials. So you should know that. And let me just get back to Marxism briefly, because it's in this section of the book. Know the basis for Marxist theory, and it's centered around the notion of class struggle. Okay, and that's all you really need to know about it, as far as, like, I think there's a quiz question on it. So it centers around class struggle, and it's interesting. And I'll make the lecture a little longer because I want to talk about it. But Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who were really the masters behind this idea of Marxism, it was just a theory. I mean, it was just something that he thought through as he observed what was going on with industrialization. And Karl Marx was writing this stuff like in 1845, 1846, 1848. And he was writing it because industrialization was new. The factory working class was new. And he and Engels looked at this working class and said that eventually these workers are going to take over, and they're going to own the means of production. They're going to take over the factories. And Marx had this grand theory of history that this is the way things were going to shake out, that the proletariat, which is the working class, would rise up against the bourgeois, and that's the upper class, and take over the factories, and there would be a revolution, and it would eventually lead to communism. And in a communist society, all the manufacturing is owned by the state. The workers control everything. There's no private property. There's no religion, so on and so forth. And so that was Marx's theory based on his observations in 1848. And again, the impact of the theory can't be overstated, because it's just a theory. I mean, it's something like you or I would come up in our office as we're writing, but it really changed the world, and it set us up for this divide between capitalism and communism, which to me fundamentally is really a bunch of BS, and I'll go on to explain that. I can't tell you how many years I spent in grad school listening to people talk about Marxism and was it going to happen and so on and so forth. The bottom line is Marxism can't work. It just can't. And my professors in grad school would be cringing right now because they were all Marxist scholars. But Marxism is built on this fundamental idea that humans don't have any desire to improve their condition, or they don't possess any greed. And greed sounds a little negative, but to put a positive spin on it, we all want to do the best we can to grow financially and as a person and as a professional. But we want to be able to do it on our terms. We don't want the state to dictate to us, oh, you're a professor and you make X number of dollars a year and that's all you can do. And you can't get out of that. You can't become an author and sell books unless the state says you can. You can't buy property if you want to be a farmer unless the state says you can. So there are major fundamental flaws in Marxism that run against human nature. And you won't read about that anywhere. It's my theory. It's just so obvious to me. And the other thing is, in the world of evidence-based results, Marxism has never worked. Communism has never worked. And if you reference the revolution, the Russian Revolution, which we're going to read about next week, where Russia takes on this idea through Lenin that they're going to become Marxist and communist. Well, they did that, but it never worked. It was a complete and total failure. Their economy collapsed in '89. It still struggles today, and the level of poverty and poor agricultural workers in Russia is astounding, and with no money. So communism doesn't work, and people will say, well, what about China? Look at how China's communist, and look at how their economy is going. I would say, and pardon my French here, but I would say that's bullshit, because China is really a capitalist country in the sense that the entire nation is one capitalist machine. And there is some private ownership in China. There is a lot of corruption in China, like there is in the U.S., but it's all because people are trying to make money. They're trying to find these opportunities off to the side. And so the impulse of human nature is to improve your lot or your being, and the way you do that is to make more money, and sometimes the way you do that is to innovate or to find something else to do, and that's extremely hard in a communist regime. But again, I don't know. It's look at North Korea. So there you go. That's the pure communist society. Is that working? I would say not. The standard of living there is poor, and they all have to dress the same and do the same stuff, and that's just not human nature. So really, enough on that. I'm not a Marxist. I love the theory. It's really smart, and it was really appealing because it made sense, but it doesn't work, and bottom line. So, and if someone wants to argue with me, just show me a country where it's worked, and I'll eat my hat or whatever. So that's Marxism. So the only thing you need to know about Marxism is it's based on this idea of class struggle. So if you know that, you're good for the quiz. And then the book talks about the rise in nationalism, and it talks a little bit about the concept of liberalism. So you should know what liberalism is. It's basically what we live in the United States, and it doesn't really have anything to do with liberals and conservatives on the micro level like in the U.S., but liberalism is this idea of sort of an open society where people basically can do whatever they want, and the government's in place to sort of set some boundaries, if you will. So that's liberalism. There's not a quiz question on it. But nationalism, there is a quiz question on, and it's a real easy one. So what's nationalism? Nationalism is when a society comes together based on some common characteristics that allow them to identify as, like Americans, or identify as Germans. So usually nationalism comes out of societies with common customs, common languages, common traditions, sometimes common religions, not always. And there's a quiz question on it, and I think you have to pick like the 3 characteristics that lead to nationalism. But if you see something that says, language, customs, whatever makes sense to you, those are the answers. So that's on there. How do we spot nationalism? Why does it happen? Historically, it happens on a big cycle. Japan was certainly nationalized prior to World War II. Germany was really nationalized under Hitler, and we'll get to that as we move forward. But the United States is nationalized also on occasion. We're a little different because we're big and diverse, but still we all come together as Americans. And, my classic example is always when the jetliners flew into the World Trade Tower. All the senators came out, Republicans and Democrats, and sang "America the Beautiful" together. So that's this nationalism where we all come together as Americans when we need to. So other classic examples are the campaigns to get people to enlist for war. So, be an American, Uncle Sam wants you, all for one. That's nationalism. And you hear nationalist rhetoric all the time. So here's a classic nationalist rhetoric piece is "Make America Great Again." So you hear that all the time in politics, and the other side it says something like "Keep America Great." So again, they're playing to this national impulse, and that's real popular with politicians because it's something we can all rally around. Go America. And so that's what nationalism is, and typically it leads to war over a long period of time because people kind of think, hey, we're the best there is and we're the most powerful there is, so we're going to take what's ours. We're going to take this land. We're going to do this. So when you think about when we get to World War II, that's a big deal. But in this chapter, it's interesting because this combination of nationalism and industrialization builds these incredibly powerful military regimes. So Japan's a great example. I mean, highly nationalistic and highly industrialized in the late 1800s. That's going to give them the ability to build weapons of war and also prompt them to become more imperialist because they need to go out and find raw materials and markets, that sort of thing. And so, same in Germany. Hitler is going to rally the people in, 40 or 50 years from where we're at, around this notion of, hey, we're all Germans, we're all one. And so that's what nationalism is. It's not good or bad. It's just a concept that you should be aware of. I mean, we all identify as something, whether we identify as Americans, Americans of color, Spanish Americans, African Americans, we all identify as Americans in some sense. And then we identify in these smaller communities as well. So there's enough of that. National unification is part of this chapter, and I know this is a really long lecture, but I want to get through it. Just make a mental note that Italy and Germany both unify under these nationalist regimes, and it's important to understand that as we get into the next chapter on World War I, that Italy has this strong heritage, strong language commonality, strong Catholicism, and Germany too has this strong language and this strong loyalty to the German cause, if you will. So national unification, just keep it on your radar screen. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention, because it gives you food for thought, when you read through this chapter, you'll read about some of these countries, I'll call them states, but they're countries, like Germany and like Great Britain and like France. One of the things you read, especially in Great Britain, and it also happens in Germany, around the late 1800s, early 1900s, they're already establishing these social programs. So when you think of like national health care, Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, that sort of stuff, England had this in place in the early 1900s. And Germany had it in place in the late 1800s under Bismarck. So this idea of these social reforms and social programs, Europe is on this early, and the U.S. still is not. And there's some reasons for that, I think. But I won't get into them now. Maybe we'll talk about it in a subsequent lecture because this is going long. But I just want you to know that, in our day-to-day life right now, when we talk about, how come the government doesn't give me unemployment? How come the government doesn't give me health insurance? How come the government can't help me? Especially in the middle of a pandemic when Washington's trying to figure out what to do. The European nations were doing that, 100 years ago. And now in the U.S., people are like, those are socialist programs. They're awful. Well, I don't want to get into that right now. But the bottom line is those programs have been in place and they've worked there. And it's just interesting to note because, we often feel like we're the most advanced, cutting edge society if you're an American. And the reality of it is you see that we're woefully behind and have been for a long time on some of the things that help people. All right, as far as taking care of people. And a lot of that's because we're so capitalist and we're so independent that we say, go out and get a job and work and buy your own insurance. I mean, that's the way we are. We're so hands-off as a capitalist society that we have difficulty having the state provide anything for us. So I'll leave it at that. The lecture's gone over 20 minutes, which I apologize for. You have the quiz this week. I went through the quiz questions, and you can also look at what's bolded on my reading notes, and the quiz questions will be tied into those bolded statements. Lastly, if I have anything I haven't graded yet from a month ago, just because of changes in my personal situation, I'll get those done soon. I'm working on them right now, as a matter of fact. So that's it for now. Sorry for the long lecture. Have a great week. Take care. Bye-bye.